My husband told me he loved me for the first time in 40 years. And I knew something was terribly wrong. We were sitting in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning, when Tom looked up from his oatmeal and said it, just like that. "I love you, sweetheart." The spoon slipped from my hand and clattered against the bowl. In 4 decades of marriage, through raising 3 kids, through my mother's funeral, through his retirement party last year, he'd never once said those words. He was a good man, don't misunderstand me. He worked hard, paid the bills, showed up. But emotional? That wasn't Tom. He'd grown up in a household where men didn't talk about feelings. And he'd carried that silence into our marriage like a stone in his pocket. That morning, though, something in his eyes looked different. Softer, maybe. Or maybe just confused. I made an appointment with Dr. Patterson the next day, but Tom refused to go. He insisted he was fine, that I was overreacting. Our daughter Susan called me paranoid when I mentioned it to her. "Dad's just getting older, Mom," she said over the phone while I heard her kids screaming in the background. "Maybe he's finally learning to express himself. Isn't that what you always wanted?" I didn't know how to explain that this wasn't growth. It felt like something breaking. 3 weeks later, Tom forgot how to get home from the grocery store. The police found him 2 towns over, sitting in his truck in a Walmart parking lot. Unable to remember our address. That's when I knew we couldn't ignore it anymore. The diagnosis came in October, 2 weeks before our 40th anniversary. Early onset dementia, drive. Patterson said, probably Alzheimer's. Progressive, irreversible. I sat in that sterile office and watched Tom smile at the doctor. Like they were discussing the weather. He didn't understand what was happening to him. Maybe that was a mercy. But as the months went by, and his memory started slipping away in pieces, something strange happened. The man who'd barely touched me for years started reaching for my hand. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and pull me close. Whispering things he'd never said before. "You're so beautiful," he'd murmur into my hair. "I don't deserve you." Sometimes he'd cry, these deep shaking sobs, and when I asked him what was wrong, he'd say he was sorry. So sorry. I didn't understand what he was apologizing for. Our kids thought I was losing my mind along with him. Our son Michael lived 30 minutes away, but visited maybe once a month, always rushing out the door after 20 minutes. Susan called every week, but the conversations were brief, distracted. Only our youngest, David, seemed genuinely concerned, though he lived in Seattle and couldn't help much from across the country. The real problems started when Tom's condition deteriorated enough that he needed full-time care. I'd been managing okay, taking him to adult daycare 3 times a week, while I worked part-time at the library. But then he started wandering. Twice I found him outside at 3 in the morning, barefoot in his pajamas, trying to go to a job he'd retired from a year ago. I couldn't sleep anymore. Couldn't leave him alone for even an hour. I called Michael and asked if he could stay with his father one afternoon a week, so I could go to my own doctor's appointments. He said he'd think about it. He never called back. That's when Michael's wife, Diane, started coming around. At first I thought she was being helpful, bringing groceries, asking how Tom was doing. But she'd walk through our house with these sharp eyes, looking at everything. The furniture, the paintings, the family heirlooms my mother had left me. "You know, you should really think about putting Tom in a facility," she said one afternoon while Tom napped upstairs. "This is too much for you to handle alone." I told her I'd made a promise to Tom years ago that I'd never do that. He'd watched his own mother waste away in a nursing home. And he'd made me swear, whatever happened, wherever life took us, we'd face it together at home. Diane smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Promises made to a man who can't remember his own name don't really count, do they? I asked her to leave. 2 weeks later, Michael showed up with a lawyer. They wanted to discuss Tom's finances, they said. Make sure everything was in order. I sat at my own dining room table, while a stranger in a suit explained that because Tom's dementia was progressing, we needed to establish a power of attorney immediately. Michael was suggesting himself for the role. Something cold settled in my stomach. I'm his wife, I said slowly. I already have power of attorney. Tom and I set that up years ago. The lawyer glanced at Michael. Something passed between them that I didn't like. Of course, the lawyer said smoothly. But given the financial complexity of your husband's retirement accounts and investments, Michael feels it might be wiser to have someone with more business experience managing things. No offense intended, Mrs. Morrison, but you've never handled the finances, have you? He was right about that. Tom had always managed the money, and I'd been content to let him. But that didn't mean I was incompetent. I told them no, absolutely not. If Tom needed help managing his accounts, I'd learn how to do it myself. Michael's face hardened in a way I'd never seen before. Mom, be reasonable. You can barely handle taking care of Dad. How are you going to manage a portfolio worth over $2 million? $2 million. I stared at my son. Tom and I lived modestly, always had. I knew he'd saved for retirement, knew we had investments somewhere. But I'd never asked the exact numbers. $2 million seemed impossible. How do you know that? I asked. Michael shifted in his seat. Dad told me, before he got really bad. Something about that felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I stood up and told them both to leave. The lawyer gathered his papers with a tight smile. But Michael lingered at the door. You're going to need help eventually, Mom, he said quietly. And when you do, don't be surprised if the help comes with conditions. That night, I went through Tom's desk for the first time in our marriage. I found files, statements, documents I barely understood. But I found something else too. A letter, addressed to me, in Tom's handwriting. It was dated 5 years ago, before the dementia started. My hands shook as I read it. The letter explained everything. Tom had grown up in a house where his father beat his mother, where love was weakness and tenderness got you hurt. He'd sworn he'd never be like his father. Never raise his voice, never lift his hand. But in avoiding his father's cruelty, he'd built walls so high he couldn't figure out how to climb over them. He loved me, the letter said. He'd always loved me, but he didn't know how to show it, didn't know how to be soft. When he'd spent his whole childhood learning to be hard. He was sorry, the letter said. So sorry. He'd been planning to give it to me on our 40th anniversary. Along with a promise to finally try, to finally break down those walls. But then the diagnosis came. And the words got lost in the fog of his failing mind. I sat at his desk and cried until my throat was raw. The next morning, I called Elder Protective Services and reported my concerns about Michael and Diane. The caseworker who came to the house was kind but skeptical. She looked around our clean, organized home, watched me interact with Tom, and seemed satisfied that everything was fine. When I tried to explain about Michael's sudden interest in the finances, about the lawyer, she patted my hand like I was a child. Family disagreements during stressful times are very common, Mrs. Morrison, she said gently. It sounds like your son is just trying to help. I called a lawyer of my own after that, but he said the same thing. Unless Michael actually did something illegal, there wasn't much I could do to prevent him from challenging the power of attorney arrangement. Your best bet is to keep detailed records of everything, he advised. Every penny spent, every decision made. If it goes to court, you'll need to prove you're a responsible steward of your husband's assets. Court, the word made me feel sick. But I did what the lawyer said. I started keeping meticulous records, learning how to read investment statements, talking to Tom's financial advisor. That's when I discovered that someone had already been making changes to Tom's accounts. Small transfers, nothing huge, but consistent. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. All authorized with Tom's signature. Signatures that looked nothing like the shaky scrawl Tom produced these days. I brought the statements to Michael, confronted him at his office. He barely looked up from his computer. Dad asked me to help him move some money around, he said flatly. He was worried about the market, wanted things more secure. I was doing him a favor. When did he ask you this? 6 months ago, before he got really bad. 6 months ago. Tom couldn't remember what day of the week it was. There was no way he'd been making complex financial decisions. I told Michael the first was going to the police, to the bank, to whoever would listen. He finally looked at me then, and his expression was cold. Go ahead, he said. Tell them your husband with dementia signed some papers. They'll think he did it. Or they'll think you're a confused old woman who doesn't understand her own finances. Either way, good luck proving anything. He was right. When I went to the police, they took a report, but didn't seem particularly concerned. Family financial disputes weren't really their jurisdiction, they said. I should handle it through civil court. The bank was even less helpful. The signatures looked close enough to Tom's, they said. And without clear evidence of fraud, their hands were tied. I felt the walls closing in. Diane started showing up at the house more often, always with some excuse. Bringing dinner, picking up mail, checking on Tom. I stopped letting her in, started locking the doors even during the day. She'd stand on the porch and knock until I answered, her smile tight and dangerous. You're isolating yourself, she called through the door one afternoon. People are starting to notice. They're starting to talk. She wasn't wrong about that. I'd stopped going to church, stopped seeing friends. Taking care of Tom was a full-time job, and I didn't trust anyone else with him. The few friends who still called said I sounded paranoid, said I needed to take care of myself, said I should consider getting Tom proper care. Nobody seemed to understand that I was giving him proper care. The only care that mattered. Then Tom fell. I'd only left him alone for 5 minutes. Just long enough to move laundry from the washer to the dryer. I heard the crash and ran upstairs to find him on the bathroom floor. Blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. The ambulance came. The paramedics asked their questions. How often did he fall? Was I supervising him properly? Did I think I could really handle this on my own? I saw their judgment, felt it pressing down on me like a weight. At the hospital, Michael and Diane showed up within an hour. Too fast. Someone must have called them. They stood in the hallway talking to Tom's doctor, while I sat beside my husband's bed, holding his hand. He looked so small under those harsh fluorescent lights, so fragile. This man who'd built our house with his own hands. Who'd carried our kids on his shoulders. Who'd stayed distant and silent because he thought that's what strength looked like. The doctor came in with Michael and Diane behind him. Mrs. Morrison, the doctor said carefully. We need to discuss your husband's living situation. His injuries today could have been much worse. In his condition, he needs 24-hour supervision. Professional medical care. Have you considered a memory care facility? No, I said. Absolutely not. Michael stepped forward. Mom, you're not being rational. You can't keep him safe. Today proved that. Today proved I looked away for 5 minutes. That could happen anywhere. In a facility, there would be multiple staff members watching him at all times. He'd be safe. You could visit every day. I'm not breaking my promise to him. Diane's voice was sharp. He doesn't even remember that promise, does he? I looked at her, this woman who'd married my son 6 years ago. and somehow turned him into someone I barely recognized. "Get out," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" "Get out of this room. Get out of this hospital. Stay away from my husband." The doctor cleared his throat awkwardly. Michael's face flushed red. "You can't talk to my wife like that." "I just did. Now leave before I call security." They left, but I knew it wasn't over. Michael filed papers the next week, petitioning the court for guardianship of Tom. The claim was simple: I wasn't mentally or physically capable of caring for my husband. I was isolating him from family, making poor financial decisions, and putting his safety at risk. He had medical reports from the hospital, statements from people in our neighborhood who'd seen Tom wandering, even a testimony from our pastor, who said I'd stopped attending church services. I hired a lawyer with money I'd squirreled away in an old savings account Tom didn't know about. My emergency fund, I'd always called it. I never thought I'd be using it to fight my own son. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, looked over all the documents and gave it to me straight. "Your son has a decent case," she said. "The hospital report works in his favor. And judges tend to err on the side of caution with elder care. But if we can prove he has ulterior financial motives, we might be able to fight this." I showed her the bank statements, the forged signatures, everything I'd found. She nodded slowly. "This helps, but it's circumstantial. We need something concrete. Do you have access to your son's financial records? Any proof he's benefiting from these transfers?" I didn't, but I knew someone who might. David flew in from Seattle the next day. My youngest son, the one who'd always been different from Michael. Gentler, more thoughtful. He'd gone into tech instead of following Michael into their father's old construction business. The two brothers barely spoke anymore, hadn't for years. Some falling out over business decisions that I'd never fully understood. I told David everything over coffee in my kitchen. He listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something about Michael." What David revealed made my blood run cold. 3 years ago, Michael's construction company had nearly gone bankrupt. He'd made bad bids on several projects, extended himself too far, and when the market crashed, he'd been left with massive debts. He'd asked Tom for a loan, and Tom had refused. Said Michael needed to learn from his mistakes, stand on his own feet. It had caused a huge fight, one of the few times I'd ever seen Tom really angry. But the company had somehow survived. Bounced back. Michael had claimed he'd found private investors, restructured his debts. Now David was saying he knew where that money had really come from. "He's been skimming from Dad for years," David said. "Small amounts at first, just enough to keep his business afloat. But lately it's gotten bigger. I think he's in trouble again, Mom. And I think he sees Dad's money as his inheritance, something he's entitled to." "Can you prove it?" David smiled grimly. "I'm a data analyst. Give me 24 hours. What my son uncovered over the next day was stunning. Using publicly available business records, financial statements Michael had been required to file, and some creative database searches. I didn't entirely understand. David built a paper trail. Money had been flowing from Tom's accounts into shell companies, then into Michael's business. Over $300,000 in the past 2 years alone. The transfers had accelerated after Tom's diagnosis, gotten sloppier. Michael had been counting on no one looking closely, counting on me. Not understanding the finances. He'd underestimated his mother. Patricia Chen took the evidence and smiled for the first time since I'd hired her. "This changes everything," she said. "File a police report tomorrow." I did. This time, when I walked into the police station, with David beside me and a folder full of documentation, they listened. A detective took my statement. looked over the evidence, and opened an investigation into financial elder abuse. The bank froze Tom's accounts pending the investigation. Michael's petition for guardianship was put on hold. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt exhausted. Tom was getting worse every day. Sometimes didn't recognize me when he woke up in the morning. I'd devoted 40 years to a man who couldn't show love. And now that he finally could, he was disappearing piece by piece. But at least I was protecting him. At least I was honoring my promise. The court case took 3 months to resolve. In the end, Michael was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He plea bargained down to restitution and probation, avoiding jail time but destroying his reputation in the process. His construction company folded within weeks. Diane filed for divorce 2 months later. The judge denied Michael's petition for guardianship and issued a restraining order, keeping him away from both Tom and me. I kept power of attorney. The money Michael had stolen was returned to Tom's accounts. Though legal fees ate up a good chunk of it, I won. But it felt hollow. Tom didn't understand any of it. Most days now he didn't even remember he had children. But he remembered me, in his way. He'd see me across the room, and his face would light up like he was seeing the sun for the first time. "There you are," he'd say. "I've been looking for you." And he'd tell me he loved me, over and over, these words he'd kept locked away for 40 years now spilling out without filter or restraint. Sometimes I wish I'd heard them when he was whole, when he meant them with his full mind. Other times I think maybe this is exactly when I needed to hear them most. When everything else was stripped away and only the truth remained. On our 41st anniversary, I took Tom to the park, where he'd proposed 4 decades earlier. He didn't remember it, but he held my hand and smiled at the ducks on the pond. When I told him I loved him, he said it back without hesitation. Like it was the easiest thing in the world. Maybe for him, finally, it was.